Germany lost the Battle of Stalingrad because of decisions made months before the fighting even started. Between August 1942 and February 1943, more than 800,000 German and Axis soldiers fought in one of the largest battles of the Second World War. The Sixth Army, one of the most powerful forces in the German military, advanced toward a city on the Volga River. By the time these troops reached Stalingrad, they were already weakened by extreme heat, widespread disease, and supply shortages. They then fought for months in conditions that removed every advantage they had. Of the soldiers trapped in the final encirclement, only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. Most accounts of Stalingrad focus on the brutal urban combat, the harsh winter, or Soviet determination. These factors played a role in the outcome. However, they do not explain why Germany committed so many forces to a battle it could not win. The real causes of the defeat were already in place before the first German units entered the city. The Nazi dictator's obsession with capturing a city that bore Stalin's name led him to prioritize symbolism over sound strategy. Supply lines were stretched far beyond their capacity, leaving troops without adequate food, fuel, and ammunition. German tactics and equipment were designed for fast-moving warfare in open terrain, not close-quarters fighting in destroyed buildings. The arrival of winter helped Soviet forces far more than it hurt them, and the Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies guarding the German flanks were too poorly equipped to stop a major Soviet attack. Each of these problems developed before the battle reached its worst phase. Together, they made the destruction of the Sixth Army nearly unavoidable. Understanding how this happened requires examining the months and years leading up to the fighting in Stalingrad. Section 1. The Setup. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in military history. The objective was to defeat the Soviet Union before winter arrived. According to Antony Beevor in his book Stalingrad, The Fateful Siege, the Red Army lost approximately 3,500 tanks, over 6,000 aircraft, and around 2 million men in the first 3 weeks alone. In late July, German forces encircled Soviet troops near Smolensk and took approximately 300,000 prisoners. The encirclement at Kiev on September 21, 1941, resulted in what Hitler called the greatest battle in world history, with Germans claiming over 665,000 Soviet soldiers captured. These figures suggested that total victory was near. However, beneath the surface of these victories, serious problems were developing. General Franz Halder, the chief of the German Army General Staff, noted a troubling pattern during this period. At the outset of the war, German planners had expected to face about 200 Soviet divisions. By mid-August 1941, they had already counted 360. The enemy was not collapsing as expected. Instead, new Soviet forces kept appearing faster than the Germans could destroy them. German losses were also mounting at an alarming rate. Wehrmacht casualties had exceeded 400,000 as of late August 1941. The German military was advancing, but it was suffering heavy losses in the process. These were experienced soldiers who could not be easily replaced, and their absence would weaken future operations. The invasion also revealed a basic mistake in German strategic planning. The Nazi leadership had launched the most ambitious land campaign in history without fully mobilizing the German economy for total war. Beevor described this approach as the act of a compulsive gambler who was subconsciously striving to increase the odds against himself. The entire campaign depended on achieving a quick victory, and as autumn 1941 arrived, that outcome was becoming increasingly unlikely. In late September, the German military launched Operation Typhoon, the offensive against Moscow. This attack came too late in the year. The Führer had diverted forces to Leningrad in the north and Ukraine in the south during the summer months. These decisions cost critical weeks of favorable weather that could not be recovered. Then, the weather itself became an enemy. In mid-October, the Rasputitsa arrived. This Russian term refers to the season of mud, when autumn rains transform roads into deep mud that cannot be crossed. Vehicles became stuck up to their axles, supply columns halted completely, and horses drowned in mud holes along the route. The advance slowed to a crawl at precisely the moment when speed was most critical. The difficulties extended beyond weather conditions. As temperatures dropped in November and December, German troops found themselves completely unprepared for the severe Russian winter. They had only summer uniforms, lacked winter-grade lubricants for their weapons, and their vehicle engines froze solid in the extreme cold. During this same period, Soviet reinforcements arrived from Siberia. Intelligence had confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east, which allowed Stalin to transfer these experienced winter troops to defend the capital. These Siberian soldiers were trained for cold weather operations. They had proper clothing, functional equipment, and the knowledge to survive and fight effectively in conditions that were causing severe casualties among German forces. In December 1941, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive that drove the Germans back from Moscow. The prospect of a quick victory had disappeared. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, wrote during this period that the vastness of Russia was devouring the German army. As 1942 began, the strategic situation was clear. Germany had failed to defeat the Soviet Union in a single campaign. The war would continue into a second year and beyond, with enormous casualties and severe equipment losses already sustained. The question now was what course of action to pursue next, and the answer would lead directly to Stalingrad. Section 2. The Road to Stalingrad. In the spring of 1942, German commanders began planning a new offensive for the summer. The main goal was to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus region in the southern Soviet Union. These oil fields at Maikop, Grozny, and Baku were essential for Germany's war effort. Without oil, the tanks would stop, the planes would not fly, and the entire military machine would grind to a halt. Under this original plan, called Operation Blue, the city of Stalingrad was not supposed to be captured. It was only meant to be neutralized. German forces would advance to the Volga River and cut off the city, protecting the northern flank of the army, moving south into the Caucasus. The city itself had no real value beyond this defensive purpose. This plan made strategic sense. It focused resources on a clear objective while avoiding unnecessary fighting for a city that produced nothing Germany needed. Yet, Hitler changed everything with a single order. On July 23, 1942, the Führer issued Directive No. 45, completely rewriting the entire operation. The directive opened with a dangerously incorrect statement. The German leader declared that in a campaign lasting little more than 3 weeks, the objectives he had outlined for the Southern Front had been largely achieved. He claimed that only weak enemy forces had escaped encirclement. This was incorrect, as the campaign was far from complete and large Soviet forces remained in the field. Nevertheless, based on this incorrect belief, the Führer expanded the objectives far beyond what the available forces could achieve. Under the new directive, the Sixth Army would no longer just advance to the Volga River. It would take and occupy Stalingrad. Paulus was also ordered to send motorized groups down the Volga all the way to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. At the same time, Army Group A was ordered to seize the entire eastern coast of the Black Sea and most of the Caucasus Mountain region. Field Marshal Wilhelm List, who commanded Army Group A, stared at this order in disbelief. The objectives were impossible for the forces he had been given. General Halder recorded his concerns in his diary during this period. He wrote that the constant underestimation of enemy strength was becoming grotesque and was now dangerous. But the directive contained an even more dangerous flaw. The new plan created what military planners call the division of forces. German troops were now split between two major objectives that were hundreds of miles apart. Army Group A headed south toward the Caucasus oil fields, while the 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army headed east toward Stalingrad. Neither group had enough strength to achieve its goals. Both were weakened by being separated from each other, which meant they could not support one another if either ran into serious trouble. To make matters worse, Hitler pulled forces away from the southern front entirely. The 11th Army under General Erich von Manstein, which had just captured the fortress of Sevastopol, was sent north to the Leningrad front. Elite divisions like Großdeutschland and SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler were transferred back to France, far from where the main fighting was happening. These decisions made no sense if the goal was to win the campaign in the south. They only made sense if the Führer believed victory was already assured, which it was not. Meanwhile, a dangerous gap was forming along the flanks. The long lines stretching west from Stalingrad toward the Don River were not protected by German troops. Instead, they were held by Allied armies from Romania, Italy, and Hungary. The Romanian Third Army held the line north of Stalingrad. The Romanian Fourth Army held positions to the south, while the Italian Eighth Army and Hungarian Second Army extended even further west. These Allied forces were large in number. Together, they fielded hundreds of thousands of soldiers. However, they lacked adequate equipment for the operations ahead. They lacked anti-tank weapons capable of stopping Soviet armor, their artillery was outdated, and their soldiers were not as well trained as German troops. Many were not motivated to fight and perish far from their homelands for German objectives. German officers recognized this weakness and warned that the flanks were dangerously exposed, but these warnings were ignored at the highest levels. As late summer arrived, the 6th Army was marching toward Stalingrad with weakened support on both sides and supply lines stretching over enormous distances. The army moving into the Caucasus was even more isolated. The conditions for a disaster were already in place before either objective had been reached. Several men would play central roles in the events that followed. Friedrich Paulus commanded the 6th Army. He was a careful staff officer who had helped plan Operation Barbarossa, but he had never commanded troops in combat before receiving this assignment. In January 1942, he had been promoted to general of panzer troops and given one of the most powerful armies in the German military. He was an intelligent and professional soldier, but he was also loyal to orders and reluctant to challenge decisions from above. He would lead the 6th Army into Stalingrad and ultimately surrender there. On the Soviet side, General Georgy Zhukov oversaw the defense and later planned the counter-offensive. He was one of the most capable commanders of the entire war, known for his willingness to take bold action and his ability to coordinate massive operations. General Vasily Chukov commanded the Soviet 62nd Army inside Stalingrad itself. He developed the tactics of close-range urban combat that would negate German advantages. He kept his headquarters close to the front lines and refused to retreat across the Volga River. Above them all stood the two dictators whose decisions would determine the outcome. Stalin demanded that the city bearing his name be held at all costs and told his commanders that the troops must understand there was nowhere to retreat. His order was simple: not one step back. In turn, Hitler became obsessed with taking a city of such symbolic importance. For him, Stalingrad stopped being a military objective. It became a matter of personal prestige. Capturing the city named after his greatest enemy would be a propaganda triumph. Failing to take it, or withdrawing from it, would be a humiliation he could not accept. This obsession would drive decisions that destroyed an army. Section 3. The Silent Collapse. The symbolic importance of Stalingrad began to drive decisions that made no strategic sense at all. The city had been called Tsaritsyn before the Russian Revolution, but Stalin had renamed it after himself to commemorate his role in defending it during the Russian Civil War. Originally, the German operation aimed to protect the flank of the army moving into the Caucasus to seize oil. However, once the 6th Army became locked in combat inside Stalingrad, this purpose was forgotten. Although the city's industrial facilities, including a large tractor factory that had been converted to tank production, were destroyed by German bombing and reduced to burned-out ruins, the battle continued because the name on the map could not be surrendered. The obsession with symbolism went beyond military calculations. During the fighting, Paulus chose a grain silo as the symbol for an army badge to commemorate the victory. This early celebration proved mistaken, as the victory never came and the badge was never issued. As the battle continued through September and October 1942, the German position became increasingly difficult. Progress was measured in yards, while casualties mounted daily. A rational assessment would have suggested limiting objectives or pulling back to stronger defensive positions for the winter. Instead, the Führer refused to consider any withdrawal. According to historian Beaver, during a midday conference at his headquarters, he told General Kurt Zeitzler, the Army Chief of Staff, that retreating from Stalingrad was impossible. He argued that leaving the city would mean sacrificing the whole meaning of the campaign and insisted that too much blood had been shed to give up now. This reasoning was circular. Germany had to keep fighting because they had already been fighting, with losses justifying more losses. Although the strategic purpose was gone, the symbolic commitment remained. However, the most dangerous decision was still ahead. After Soviet forces encircled the Sixth Army in November 1942, the Nazi dictator ordered the trapped troops to hold their position as Fortress Stalingrad. He refused to allow a breakout attempt that might have saved part of the army. He based this decision partly on his experience the previous winter. During the Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow in December 1941, he had ordered German troops to hold their positions rather than retreat. This order had prevented a chaotic collapse and probably saved Army Group Center from complete destruction. Now he applied the same thinking to Stalingrad, even though the situations were completely different. Outside Moscow, German troops had held a continuous defensive line. At Stalingrad, they were completely surrounded with no way to receive adequate supplies. The Führer also believed that any retreat would lead to complete collapse. He had once stated that when a unit starts to flee, the bonds of law and order quickly disappear. Fearing that the Sixth Army would disintegrate in the snow if they attempted a breakout, he ordered them to stay and die instead. Beaver compared this disaster to a tale by the Russian writer Leo Tolstoy called "How Much Land Does a Man Need?" In the story, a peasant named Pahom tries to claim as much land as he can walk around in a single day. He runs farther and farther, always wanting more until the effort kills him. As he perishes, he thinks to himself that he has grasped too much and ruined the whole affair. The difference at Stalingrad, the historian observed, was that it was not a single man buried there in the steppe. It was hundreds of thousands of them. Meanwhile, a separate crisis was developing behind the front lines. The German supply system was collapsing under the strain of the advance. The problems began with the railroads. Because Soviet railways used a wider gauge than German ones, every mile of track had to be relayed to allow German trains to pass. Unable to keep pace with the advance, this work fell behind while supply trains backed up hundreds of miles behind the front lines, creating massive bottlenecks. The roads presented an even greater challenge. Although German maps showed highways connecting major Soviet cities, these highways turned out to be dirt tracks on the ground. Rain transformed them into rivers of mud that swallowed vehicles up to their axles, while dry conditions produced clouds of fine dust that clogged engines and caused constant breakdowns. Replacement parts were in desperately short supply. On July 22, 1942, temperatures reached 53 degrees Celsius in the sun, causing soldiers to collapse from heat exhaustion on the march. Water was scarce because Soviet troops had poisoned wells as they retreated, leaving men to suffer terribly from thirst. Disease began to spread rapidly through the ranks. As soldiers suffered from dysentery, typhus, and paratyphus, flies swarmed in horrible numbers around field kitchens and medical stations, spreading sickness wherever they went. Although the army desperately needed fuel, panzer columns frequently had to halt because their tanks had run dry. The Führer diverted almost every available transport aircraft to deliver fuel to the stalled armored units, which meant other supplies, including food and ammunition, could not get through in adequate quantities. Infantry soldiers marched up to 40 miles per day, carrying 55 pounds of equipment in the extreme heat. So exhausted that some fell asleep while walking, men were dying simply from exhaustion before any major combat had even begun. One unit recorded 14 deaths from this cause in just 6 days. The lack of vehicles forced the army to use desperate measures. Motor transport was so scarce that the army relied heavily on pange wagons, small peasant carts pulled by horses. These were gathered from hundreds of miles around, stripping the countryside of its basic transportation. Then, just before the Soviet encirclement, a critical mistake was made. 6th Army headquarters ordered the army's horses withdrawn to the west. The goal was to reduce the supply burden by moving the animals where fodder was more available. When the Soviet trap closed, the army discovered it had no way to move its heavy equipment without fuel. The horses were gone, and the fuel was not coming. The armored forces were in particularly poor condition. Tank crews were sent into Stalingrad to fight as infantry because there were not enough working tanks for them to operate. Later, when vehicles were finally repaired or replaced, the panzer divisions found they lacked trained crewmen to operate them. As the 6th Army approached Stalingrad, it was already weakened by heat, disease, exhaustion, and critical supply shortages. The army had not yet faced serious combat, yet the nature of the fighting ahead would turn every remaining advantage into a weakness. Section 4. Combat in the Ruins. In September 1942, the fighting inside Stalingrad began in earnest. German forces expected to take the city within days. They had overwhelming advantages in tanks, artillery, and air power, having captured cities before without serious difficulty. Instead, they entered combat that would last for months. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, which meant War of the Rats. Combat took place in destroyed buildings, flooded cellars, and factory sewers, with men fighting for single rooms, single floors, and single staircases. Tanks tried to climb over mounds of rubble and push through wrecked factory floors, their tracks screeching against twisted metal. Progress was measured in yards, sometimes in feet. The style of warfare that had won Germany so many victories no longer worked. German military success had been built on Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. This approach used fast-moving tanks, motorized infantry, and close air support to break through enemy lines and encircle large forces. It worked brilliantly in open countries like Poland and France, where speed and coordination could be used to full effect. In Stalingrad, none of this applied. The rubble-filled streets stopped tanks, while destroyed buildings blocked lines of sight. Radios could not communicate through the maze of ruins, causing units to lose contact with each other. The Luftwaffe could not bomb positions that were just yards away from German troops without killing their own men. General Vasily Chuikov, the Soviet commander inside the city, understood this perfectly. He ordered his men to keep the front line within 50 yards of the Germans at all times. At that range, German artillery and aircraft could not fire without hitting their own positions. Chuikov called this tactic hugging the enemy, which turned the German advantages into weaknesses. The main railway station in Stalingrad changed hands 15 times in just 5 days. Each time one side captured it, the other took it back in relentless and exhausting fighting. The destruction itself became an advantage for the defenders. This was one of the great ironies of the battle. German bombing and artillery destroyed the city's structures, but the resulting ruins provided excellent defensive positions for Soviet troops. General Strecker, a German corps commander, observed this problem clearly. He noted that factory walls, assembly lines, and entire buildings collapsed under the storm of bombs. But the enemy simply reappeared and used these newly created ruins to fortify their defensive positions. Every German attack created better ground for the Soviets to defend. Luftwaffe pilots saw the same thing from the air. One reported that he could not understand how men could survive such conditions, yet the Russians sat tight in the ruins and holes and cellars and kept fighting. Another felt that they achieved little by continuing to bomb what was already destroyed. The rubble improved Soviet defensive positions in several ways. It provided cover from direct fire, created obstacles that slowed German advances, and offered elevated positions for snipers and machine gunners. The very destruction the Germans caused made their task harder. The psychological pressure of the urban combat was intense. German soldiers lost track of time in what they described as an alien world of destroyed landscapes. The constant dust in the air created a strange, ghostly light at midday, leaving men uncertain whether they had been fighting for hours or days. The sounds and sights of the battle added to the strain. One German panzer officer described the overwhelming experience. The air was filled with the howling of diving Stuka aircraft, the thunder of anti-aircraft guns and artillery, the roar of engines, the rattle of tank tracks, the shriek of rocket launchers, and the constant chatter of submachine guns firing back and forth. Through all of this, he wrote, one feels the heat of a city burning at every point. The screams of wounded men affected soldiers more than any other sound. One German described it as not human at all, just the dull cry of suffering. Men had to listen to their comrades crying for help in no man's land, unable to reach them. Artillery fire was more frightening in the city than in open country. In the field, a soldier could throw himself flat and let the shrapnel pass over him. In Stalingrad, explosions sent shrapnel and chunks of masonry showering down from above, making it impossible to escape the fragments falling from shattered buildings. Soviet snipers took a heavy toll on German officers. One of the most famous was Vasily Zaitsev, a hunter from Siberia who served in the 284th Rifle Division. His skill became legendary on both sides of the line, forcing German officers to remove their insignia and avoid any behavior that might identify their rank. Officer casualties were particularly high throughout the battle. The loss of experienced leaders made it harder to coordinate attacks and maintain discipline. As the weeks went on, units were commanded by men with less and less experience. The German military had not prepared for this type of combat. According to stenographic records published in Hitler at War, Adolf Hitler, Meetings and Conferences, 1939 to 1945, the Nazi leader himself admitted this weakness in a private conversation with Finnish Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim earlier in 1942. He said that German weapons were very capable and very good, but they were purely good weather weapons. The German military was equipped for rapid campaigns in favorable conditions, not for prolonged urban combat in winter. This admission revealed a basic weakness in German military planning. The entire war effort was based on winning quickly. When quick victory proved impossible, the limitations of German equipment became critical. In November 1942, winter arrived with full force. The temperature dropped rapidly, snow covered the ground, and ice formed on the Volga River, growing thicker by the day. For the German forces, this was a disaster. Troops lacked proper winter clothing, with many still wearing summer uniforms from the advance across the steppe. Weapons malfunctioned in the extreme cold, oil froze in engines, and frostbite casualties mounted rapidly. Men who had been suffering from heat and thirst just 4 months earlier were now freezing to death in the rubble. The army had gone from one extreme to the other without ever receiving proper equipment for either condition. However, winter did not simply punish both sides equally. It actively helped the Soviets. The frozen Volga River became a highway for supplies. During the autumn fighting, Soviet forces had to ferry everything across the river under German artillery fire and air attack. Many boats were sunk, with severe casualties among the crossing troops. Once the river froze solid, trucks and even tanks could drive directly across the ice into the city. Reinforcements poured in, while ammunition and food arrived in quantities that had been impossible before. The frozen river transformed Soviet logistics. Soviet troops were also far better prepared for winter fighting. Many came from Siberia and other cold regions of the vast Soviet Union. They had proper clothing, including quilted jackets, felt boots, and fur hats, along with winter camouflage. Their weapons were designed to function in extreme cold, and they knew how to survive and fight in conditions that were killing Germans by the thousands. Nature had become a weapon that worked for only one side. The German forces were slowly freezing and starving while their enemy grew stronger with each passing week. At the same time, the German flanks were about to collapse. The positions protecting the Sixth Army at Stalingrad were held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces. These Allied armies were numerous but weak, lacking the equipment and training to withstand a major Soviet attack. German officers knew these forces were vulnerable. The Romanian divisions in particular were spread thin along an extended front. They had few anti-tank weapons capable of stopping Soviet armor, while their artillery was outdated compared to what the Soviets were massing against them. Warnings were sent to higher headquarters. The Allied armies needed reinforcement, better weapons, and shorter defensive lines. These warnings were largely ignored. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. This was a massive offensive aimed not at Stalingrad itself, but at the weak flanks on either side of the city. The plan was to break through the Allied armies and encircle the entire German force inside Stalingrad. The Romanian Third Army north of the city was hit first. The attack was overwhelming, with thousands of Soviet artillery pieces opening fire along a wide front before tanks and infantry poured through the gaps. Romanian troops fought bravely in some sectors, but they simply did not have the weapons to stop the assault. Their anti-tank guns could not penetrate Soviet armor, causing their positions to collapse sector by sector. The following day, November 20th, the Soviets attacked the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad. The same pattern repeated, and within hours, the southern flank was crumbling as well. On November 23rd, Soviet forces from the north and south met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was completely surrounded. Over 250,000 German and Allied soldiers were now trapped in a pocket that would shrink steadily under constant Soviet pressure. The encirclement had taken less than 5 days to complete. The failure of the Allied armies was not just a German military problem. It was a failure of the entire Axis alliance. Germany had stretched its forces so thin across the Eastern Front that it absolutely needed allies to hold critical positions. Yet it had not given those allies the weapons or support they required to hold those positions. On December 18th, the Italian Eighth Army also collapsed under Soviet attack further west along the Don River. General Walter Warlimont, a senior staff officer at German headquarters, called this a decisive factor in the fate of Stalingrad. The path for Soviet forces to push even deeper behind German lines was now wide open. The weakness of the Allied forces was known before the battle. It was a predictable failure that turned a risky plan into a doomed one. Nevertheless, one final chance remained to save the trapped army. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was given command of a newly formed Army Group Don and tasked with breaking through to rescue the Sixth Army. His relief operation, called Winter Storm, began on December 12th using the 4th Panzer Army. The relief force fought hard and made progress through the Soviet lines. At one point, advance units came within 35 miles of the encircled troops at Stalingrad. The men inside the pocket could see the flashes of gunfire on the horizon, making rescue seem possible, but the forces Manstein had been given were simply too weak for the task. The armored units sent to break through were badly under strength. According to Beaver, the 38th Panzer Corps, which was supposed to counter Soviet offensives, had only about 30 working tanks. The 22nd Panzer Division discovered that mice had gnawed through the electrical wiring on their vehicles during storage, disabling many of them. The division was so short of fuel that it had to borrow from Romanian reserves just to begin moving. Meanwhile, the Nazi dictator continued to block efforts to save the army. For the relief operation to succeed, the Sixth Army needed to attempt a breakout toward the approaching rescue column. The two forces would meet in the middle. Manstein requested permission for this breakout repeatedly, but the Führer refused. He also held back divisions that could have strengthened the relief force and released reserves too late for them to make a difference. General Zeitzler later made a bitter assessment of this pattern, saying that everything the Führer did was always to throw a monkey wrench in their plans. Manstein himself noted that the risk his army group was taking was extraordinary. He believed there was probably no better proof against the claim that his generals could not take risks than the desperate thrust of the 4th Panzer Army toward Stalingrad. Yet even this bold effort was not supported properly from above. As December ended, the relief operation had failed. The 4th Panzer Army was forced to retreat to avoid being cut off. Soviet pressure was increasing along the entire front, and the window of opportunity, if it had ever really existed, was closed. The airlift that was promised after the encirclement also failed to deliver. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring assured the Nazi dictator that his air force could supply the trapped Sixth Army by air. He promised a minimum of 300 tons per day. This figure was already below what the army actually needed, but it was never even close to being achieved. In the first week of the airlift, only 350 tons total were delivered. That was less than what had been promised for a single day. Of that amount, just 14 tons were food for approximately 275,000 trapped men. The second week was barely better. Through December 6th, only 512 tons total had arrived. Of that, merely 24 tons were food. 3/4 of the cargo was fuel, much of which went to the Luftwaffe's own aircraft operating from the airfield at Potomnik, inside the pocket. The best single day of the entire airlift was December 19th, when 154 aircraft landed with 289 tons of supplies. This was still below the promised daily minimum. Most days were far worse, with bad weather, enemy fighters, and anti-aircraft fire all reducing deliveries. The Sixth Army was doomed. Its only remaining question was how long it could hold out. Section 5. The Inevitable End. The destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad was not caused by any single factor. It resulted from the combination of all of them acting together. Ego and symbolism, rather than clear strategic thinking, drove the decision to capture Stalingrad. The city's name mattered more than its actual value, which led to a commitment that could not be changed even when the situation became hopeless. Supply problems existed before the battle even began. Troops arrived exhausted, sick, and short of everything they needed. When they were cut off, the promised airlift delivered only a small fraction of the minimum requirements, leaving men to starve and freeze while waiting for help that never came in adequate amounts. Fighting inside the city favored the defenders at every turn. German weapons and tactics were designed for mobile warfare in open country and good weather, but they failed completely in the frozen rubble of a destroyed city. Soviet soldiers used the ruins to negate every German advantage in tanks, artillery, and air power. Winter helped the Soviets and hurt the Germans in ways that went far beyond simple cold weather. The frozen river became a supply line, while Soviet troops were equipped and trained for winter fighting in ways that German troops were not. Allied armies protecting the flanks were too weak to resist a major attack. When they broke, the encirclement became unavoidable. Germany had stretched itself too thin across a vast front and placed its forces in a position that depended entirely on allies it had not properly equipped or supported. Each of these problems made the others worse. Proper supply lines might have allowed the army to win the urban battle before winter arrived. Quick victory might have helped them avoid the worst of the cold weather. Strong flanks might have prevented encirclement. Permission to retreat might have preserved the army to fight another day. But the Sixth Army had none of these things. Every weakness multiplied the effect of the others, creating a situation where defeat was nearly certain from the beginning. In January 1943, Soviet forces began the final destruction of the pocket. German soldiers were starving, as rations had been cut repeatedly until there was almost nothing left. Frostbite and disease killed thousands, while the wounded often froze to death because there was no fuel to heat the cellars where they lay. On January 8th, Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky sent a formal surrender demand to the Sixth Army. Terms promised life and safety, return to Germany after the war, normal food, medical care for the wounded, and the right to keep personal belongings and decorations. Paulus did not reject this offer immediately. He sent it to the Führer's headquarters and asked for freedom to act as he saw fit. According to Beaver, the response from the Nazi dictator was harsh. He demanded to know how Paulus could even ask such a thing. His orders rejected the surrender offer, which meant the demise would continue. On January 30th, the Führer made one final gesture. He promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army. No German field marshal had ever surrendered to an enemy. According to stenographic records, this promotion carried a clear message. Paulus was expected to avoid capture rather than surrender. The next day, January 31st, Field Marshal Paulus surrendered when Soviet soldiers approached his headquarters in the basement of a ruined department store. He reportedly told his staff that he refused to follow orders from this Bohemian corporal, a dismissive reference to Hitler's origins in Austria. Remaining German forces in the northern part of the pocket surrendered on February 2, 1943, ending the Battle of Stalingrad. Of the roughly 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner at the end, only about 6,000 would ever return to Germany. Most died in Soviet captivity from disease, starvation, exhaustion, and the brutal conditions of the prison camps within months of their capture. Stalingrad marked the turning point of the war in Europe. Before Stalingrad, Germany had been advancing. After Stalingrad, it would only retreat. Loss of an entire field army, one of the best in the German military, was a blow from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. Sixth Army men were dead or in Soviet prison camps. Equipment was captured or wrecked, and experience and training were gone forever. Just as important, the belief in German military superiority was destroyed. Soviet forces had proven they could not only defend against a major German offensive, but could also encircle and destroy a powerful German force in a decisive battle. The psychological impact was enormous on both sides. The defeat was not an accident. It was the predictable result of decisions that were flawed from the beginning. Strategic goals were replaced by symbolic ones. Supply lines were ignored, warnings were dismissed, allies were not supported, and retreats were forbidden. Every decision that could have prevented the disaster was rejected by a leadership that could not admit mistakes. In the end, hundreds of thousands of men paid for those decisions with their lives, frozen in the ruins of a city that should never have been attacked in the first place. Stalingrad began Germany's long retreat. Less than 3 years later, the war would end in a bunker in Berlin. To learn about those final days, be sure to watch that video next.